Detective Max Sterling sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to be different from any other he had worked on before. The city was in a state of panic, and the pressure was mounting as the body count continued to rise. The serial killer, dubbed the Black Hood Killer by the press, was leaving a trail of victims in his wake and had become the top priority of the police department. Max rubbed his temples, trying to ease the tension that had settled in his head. He had been working non-stop since the case had landed on his desk, and he was feeling the strain. "Detective Sterling, you're wanted in the captain's office," a uniformed officer called out as he walked by. Max sighed and stood up, feeling a sense of foreboding wash over him. He knew what this meeting was about, and he wasn't looking forward to it. As he made his way to the captain's office, he couldn't help but think back to the last case he had worked on. It had been a failure, a complete and utter disaster. And now, with the city in a state of panic and the Black Hood Killer still at large, the pressure was on to solve this case and bring the killer to justice. "Detective Sterling, take a seat," the captain said as Max entered the room. Max sat down and looked at the captain, waiting for him to speak. "I know you're already aware of the situation, but I wanted to touch base with you personally. The city is on edge, and we need to find this killer before he strikes again. I'm putting you in charge of the task force. You're the best detective we have, and I have complete confidence in your ability to solve this case." Max nodded, a sense of pride and determination filling him. "I won't let you down, Captain," Max said, his voice firm. "I know you won't, Detective. The city is counting on us. We need to bring this killer to justice, and we need to do it fast." Max left the captain's office and headed straight to the task force headquarters. He was greeted by a room full of detectives, all eager to bring the Black Hood Killer to justice. "All right, listen up," Max said, his voice ringing out through the room. "We're going to work around the clock until we find this killer. I want every lead followed, every witness questioned. We're going to find this guy, and we're going to bring him to justice." The detectives nodded, a sense of determination on their faces. They were all eager to solve this case and bring the killer to justice. As Max started to go over the evidence, he couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. Every lead seemed to hit a dead end, and the pressure was mounting as the body count continued to rise. "Detective Sterling, we just got a call from a witness," one of the detectives said, breaking into Max's thoughts. Max's heart raced as he followed the detective to the conference room where the witness was waiting. This could be the break they needed, the lead that would finally bring them to the Black Hood Killer. The witness, a young woman, was visibly shaken as she told her story. She described a tall, slender man with pale skin and long black hair. Max listened intently, taking note of every detail. This was the first real lead they had, and he was determined to follow it to the end. "Thank you for coming forward," Max said to the witness as he finished taking her statement. "You've been a great help." Max turned to the detectives as the witness was escorted out of the room. "Let's get to work. We have a description of the killer and a possible location. We need to move fast before he strikes again." The detectives sprang into action, following every lead and tracking down every possible clue. The killer was hiding out in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Max knew that this was his chance to bring the killer to justice, but he also knew that he had to be careful. Despite his determination and bravery, Max had a tendency to act impulsively, often putting himself in dangerous situations without backup. He couldn't let his impulsiveness get the best of him this time. Max approached the building, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the deserted streets, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he entered the building, Max was immediately struck by the eerie silence. The place was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. He could hear the sound of his own breathing, and he felt a sense of unease settling in the pit of his stomach. Max was determined to find the Black Hood Killer, but he also knew that he had to be careful. The killer was highly intelligent and cunning, but his need for control and power had made him overconfident. Max was counting on the killer's overconfidence to be his downfall this time. Max slowly made his way deeper into the building, his senses on high alert. He could hear the sound of his own footsteps. He was aware that the killer had set traps and booby traps throughout the building, and he was determined to navigate them while also avoiding the killer himself. As Max entered the third floor of the building, he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the sound of footsteps coming from down the hall. He quickly ducked into a nearby room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sound of the footsteps getting closer, and he was filled with a sense of dread. Max slowly peeked out into the hall, his hand on his gun. He could see the Black Hood killer, his tall, slender frame covered in black, his face obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. Max was filled with a sense of adrenaline as he stepped out into the hall, confronting the killer head-on. The two men locked eyes, and Max could feel the tension in the air. The killer turned to run, and Max followed. He could barely make out the shape of the shadow running in front of him, but the sound of boots pounding the deteriorating concrete floors acted as a beacon. Max saw the shadow figure slip. One knee on the ground, the other leg extended away from his body. This was his chance. With two long strides, he erased the distance between and grabbed the killer by the hood. The killer lurched to get away, but Max's grip was tight. The killer twisted and took a swing. Max dodged it. The two men engaged in a brutal and intense fight, exchanging blows and grappling for dominance. The fight spilled out into the hallway, with Max and the killer darting through the building, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. The sound of their heavy breathing filled the air. Max was determined to catch the killer, but the killer was always one step ahead, leading Max through booby-trapped rooms and narrow stairwells. As they reached the top floor of the building, Max stumbled, his foot catching on a loose piece of concrete. He fell to the ground, his gun skidding across the floor. The killer was on him in an instant, his hand closing around Max's throat. Max gasped for air, his vision blurring as the killer's grip tightened. He could feel the pain in his chest, and he knew that he had to act fast. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked out, sending the killer flying across the room. He scrambled to his feet, his hand closing around his gun. He pointed it at the killer, his hand steady. "You're not getting away with this," he said, his voice filled with determination. The killer laughed, his cold, taunting voice echoing through the room. "You're outmatched, Detective Sterling," he said. "You'll never be able to bring me to justice." He fired his gun, but the killer was too fast, dodging out of the way and diving for cover behind a nearby desk. He darted forward, his gun raised. He could hear the sound of the killer's laughter echoing through the room. He rounded the desk, his gun raised, but the killer was gone. Max searched the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the building, and he knew that the killer was getting away. He sprinted towards the stairwell, but as he reached the top of the stairs, the floor beneath him gave way. He tumbled down the stairwell, his body slamming against the concrete. He could feel the pain in his shoulder and his ribs. The killer led Max down and down the stairwell, his taunting laughter echoing through the building. Max was determined to catch the killer, but his injury was slowing him down. He could feel his strength waning, and he knew that he had to end the chase soon. As they reached the bottom floor of the building, Max rounded a corner, his gun raised. He could see the killer, his tall, slender frame silhouetted against the light from the street. "You're not getting away!" Max said, his voice filled with determination. The killer laughed, his cold, taunting voice echoing through the room. Max fired his gun, but the killer was too fast, diving behind a nearby wall for cover. Max sprinted towards the wall. As he reached the wall, Max kicked it with all his might, sending it tumbling down. The killer was trapped, his back against the wall. Max pointed his gun at the killer, his hand steady. "It's over," Max said, his voice filled with determination. The killer laughed. "You think it's that easy?" he said. "I'm always one step ahead of you." With that, the killer pulled a lever on the wall, and the floor beneath Max gave way. Max tumbled down into the darkness of the elevator shaft, his body slamming against the concrete. He could feel the pain in his shoulder and his ribs. He stumbled to his feet, his gun raised, and looked up. The killer was looking down at him, his eyes filled with amusement. "This needs to end. Why are you doing this?" Max said, his voice filled with determination. "You're in over your head, Max," he said. "I left your favorite bottle of whiskey up here. Have a drink on me when you get out there." And with that, the killer turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Max alone in the elevator shaft. Max was trapped at the bottom of the elevator shaft, his head spinning from the impact. Suddenly, The sound of footsteps echoed through the shaft, and Max is relieved to see that his fellow officers have arrived to rescue him. As he is lifted to safety, Max is filled with anger and frustration. He knows that he let his impulsiveness get the best of him, and he is determined not to let it happen again. As they drive back to the police station, Max is lost in thought, reviewing the files of the case and trying to piece together what went wrong. Max suddenly has an epiphany. He remembers the name of the woman who reported seeing the Black Hood killer, and he asks his partner to trace the call. The call was made from an internet cafe on the east side of the city. At the cafe, Max is met by a young woman who is nervous and fidgety. She tells Max that she saw the Black Hood killer in the area and was afraid for her life. Max is skeptical of her story, but he knows that he needs to keep his cool and try to get to the bottom of it. As he questions the woman, Max realizes that she is hiding something. Her story doesn't add up, and Max is convinced that she is lying. He presses her for more information, and she finally breaks down and reveals that she was paid to make the call. Max is furious, but he knows that he has to keep his cool. Max continued to question the woman, his instincts telling him that something was still not right. He pressed her for more information, his eyes scanning the room for any clues. "Ma'am, I need to know everything you know about this man. Every detail is important," Max said, his voice firm but kind. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with fear. I saw him come in here a few times. He always wore a black hoodie and gloves, so I couldn't see his face. But there was just something about him that seemed off." Max nodded, taking in the information. "Did he say anything to you? Did he act strange in any way?" The woman thought for a moment, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "Now that you mention it, he did seem to be acting strange. He was always looking over his shoulder as if he was being followed." Max's heart raced as he realized that he was getting closer to the truth. "And did you see where he went after he left here?" The woman shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. He always left in such a hurry I didn't have a chance to see where he went." Max thanked the woman for her cooperation and continued to search the room, his mind racing with thoughts of the Black Hood killer and his twisted motives. Max continued to question the woman, his instincts telling him that something was still not right. As he pressed her for more information, he noticed a small door behind the counter. Without a second thought, he drew his weapon and charged towards the door. "Police! Freeze!" Max shouted as he burst into the basement. The Black Hood killer was standing in front of him, a smug grin on his face. Max pointed his weapon at the killer, but he was ready for the confrontation. "You won't get away with this," Max growled, his eyes locked on the killer's. The killer simply laughed, his confidence only fueling Max's determination. "Officer, go around back and make sure he doesn't escape," Max shouted to his partner, who was right behind him. Max and the Black Hood killer faced off, the tension in the room palpable. The two men locked eyes, each sizing up the other. Max was the first to make a move, but the killer was quick to respond. The two engaged in a brutal and intense fight, with Max using all his training and experience to stay one step ahead of the killer. As they fought, Max's thoughts turned to the families of the victims and the need to bring the killer to justice. He was relentless in his pursuit of the truth, and he wasn't about to let the killer get away. In the end, Max was able to apprehend the killer, bringing an end to the killing spree and providing closure for the families of the victims.